Okay, good morning, Prague. Nice to be here. Let's make a start. So, wanted to first reflect on this image. This image really changed my life. It's called the pale blue dot. And as you can see, our home is just suspended in one little beam of sunshine. So just hold that thought throughout this presentation. So, hi, I'm Ryan. I'm originally from Northern Ireland, and I'm a co-founder and CTO of a company called Water Aware Collective. I also have a background in mechatronics, systems design engineering, and environmental activism, and I'm also a solar punk. So I want everyone just to have a little think about what is activism. So just take a moment, just again have that in the back of your mind. And in the meantime, I'm just going to go through a few examples. So obviously protesting, one that we're all too familiar with, which has obviously stretched itself for many, many decades. Activism. So obviously this is one of Banksy's latest pieces in Ukraine. This one is one of my personal favorites because I just thought it was genius, and it's beautiful in that it's so passive and collaborative, and that people's vehicles would just kind of go over this paint that didn't damage their cars and just create this beautiful flag in front of the Russian embassy. Something else that's very interesting from an art perspective is this idea of brandalism. So sort of taking the design language of different brands and then creating a message from that is obviously related to environmental activism. If anyone's heard of Sea Shepherd, these guys are freaking incredible. So this is like the world's first non-governmental navy. And they basically chase down illegal fishing vessels amongst a whole bunch of other cool stuff. So obviously direct action there is another great example. World Weather Attribution. So Friedrich Otto is a scientist at Imperial College London, and it's part of her job and her team's job to basically create evidence of human ties to climate change, just so we can understand obviously where we're doing things wrong, but also create that evidence base for likes of prosecution or even investment in solutions. And even what about nature itself? You know, how nature is this passive activist in some sort of respect. Obviously, this is seen more from an anthropocentric point of view. Hacktivism, so one that we're all quite familiar with. And I think the one here that really interests me is actually hacking in consumer culture. So the Flipper Zero, just allowing like ordinary people to go and hack in to different systems where they live. Again, there's a lot of great discussion topics on this about whether it's ethical, but I think that this is actually a major leap forward in democratizing these sort of solutions and getting people interested in this space. So we're naturally in an age of decentralization, democratization, but also a duty by citizens. And it also cannot be activism as usual. So what does the new era of environmental activism look like? Well, something I sort of want to begin with is this idea of environmental personhood. So this is quite provocative, but you know, what if a river could genuinely sue a person? And in New Zealand and Ecuador, this is now a reality. So giving this idea of rights that we would have to the likes of a living entity in nature. But where does technology and environmental activism complement each other very, very well? One of my favorite examples is actually looking at AI and bioacoustics. So there's a company called Reinforced Connection. And what they do is they go out to parts of the world where there's a lot of illegal logging, for example, and they fit really, really sensitive sensors that obviously listen in at different sort of frequencies. And what they can then do is map those frequencies to identify if it's illegal activity or if it's just a simple bird flying past. And then they aggregate that with geospatial data. And suddenly then they're able to target in real time illegal activities and attack them very, very fast. And they also work with indigenous communities to do this as well, which is really epic. Ultra projection, so you could say this is maybe quite a simple one, but it's actually really powerful. So again, showcasing these beautiful images of living things on our planet in spaces that are almost quite polarized. And something, again, that's quite obvious, social media, but it has had a huge impact simply because it's been very, very disruptive. But what about eco-hobbyvism? What even is that? Well, maybe I'll start by saying about a little story. So this, I don't know what's going on with the clicker there. Just decided to jump way ahead, spoilers. Now you're seeing the whole presentation, this is great. Okay, so this is my dad. He's a retired policeman of 35 years. And we're very alike in many different ways. And here's us out in the water when we were younger, or when I was younger. And I found that we could really, really connect in this space. Even more so, the fact that we may be very similar in different ways, but we're also very different in a lot of other ways as well, especially when it comes to the likes of environmental activism. But I found that, again, in these spaces, I could connect with my dad and have these conversations. And then I said, okay, well, what would it look like to take that concept and kind of do it at a more societal level? So as part of Extinction Rebellion, this is Northern Ireland. As you can see, we did this whole trip throughout the country, and we stopped off at different sections and had all sorts of conversations with all sorts of different types of people about environmental issues. And what we found, that no matter who they were willing to get involved. So obviously, this started sort of planting a few seeds in that outdoor hobbies inherently connect people, no matter, obviously, like who they are or where they're from. So then sort of taking that forward and thinking about this idea of data journalism, if we step back in history, and we look at this map of London, so it's 1854. John Snow was able to identify where the most problematic area was for the outbreak of cholera in London through crowdsourced information. And if we even look at the state of sort of water in the UK in general now, it's absolutely horrific. So these are just some posters that I designed to sort of illustrate this. Only 14% of English rivers are in good ecological state, and every single one fails chemical standards. In fact, sewage has been spilt over 700,000 times in the past 2 years alone. So again, looking at this idea of data and how we can sort of share that with all different groups of people, I then designed a map of the rivers of London in the design language of the Tube, because that's something that we're familiar with, it's something that we can follow. And with the limited data that existed actually on this issue, I then overlaid that to understand what rivers actually had the poorest water quality. So you can see here in the red, it's really, really bad. And in yellow, it's obviously not so great. And then I said, okay, well, where do people go and swim? Where do people kayak? Where do people do activities? And there's been direct correlations of where people do these activities. And no surprise, people have been getting really, really sick. And again, this is in the UK, so it's a bit like, whoa. So how can people-powered research actually create change? How can we actually gather data at scale? And what if fish could speak? So I want to tell you a little bit about my company. We're aiming to create an anti-pollution revolution. And we do that through a combination of low-cost hardware, machine learning-driven software, and citizen science. So our sensing unit, hopefully this doesn't glitch again, is able to measure the key water quality parameters such as conductivity, temperature, or pH through a modular sensing unit that can pretty much attach to anything, kayak, paddleboard, dry bag. And what we do is then we use geospatial information and we start to understand where pollution comes from. We start to see where people are swimming, and then people can take that with them on their journey and passively collect water quality data. And typically it's very expensive to do this, and there's so much gap in this country for actually collecting this data. But what we can then do through machine learning is start to take these proxy parameters on the left, and we can actually map those to specific pollutants. So sewage is E. coli. That's obviously what makes you really, really sick. And we can do this very fast. So this is just an example rendering of what a product would sort of look like with this sensing unit on it. And with that, we get actually a lot more richer data because people are moving around, likes of activity tracking. And then there's also the safety factor as well. So imagine I can just put this in the water and I know if it's good to go or not in like a couple of minutes. That's an absolute game changer. But we can attach this to many different other things. But what about an ecosystem? Well, even if you take this product or sensing unit and then we have an app behind that, like similar to Strava, we can then start to democratize that data and share it. And then we can also post on Twitter in real time where sewage or water bodies that are being severely degraded are in, and again, real time. So people can make informed decisions. So another thing that we do is we take this technology and knowledge, and then we go to places like Guyana, and we actually worked with an indigenous community in the Amazon rainforest. And we were co-designing robots to allow them to monitor their own environment and obviously monitor water quality. And what was really cool is we were sort of pushed to the edge of saying, well, how can we design these systems from almost like scrap material or natural materials that were around us? And you'll see here, this is a radio controller. So, this is just made from like wood and a little antenna. And the little controls, so the D-pad, are little beads. So again, how can we actually design differently and encourage these communities to have their own solutions? Because we all know the Amazon's getting hit pretty hard. So this is like just testing one of the crafts. So this is the McClure tribe that we were with. And we built a little boat out of bamboo. We had little turbines just there. And then you could obviously put the sensors underneath and then control it via a radio controller to fire it around a lake. And then another thing that we do is help inspire the next generation. So they're called the Wildlife Group. And these young people are super interested in technology. Something that obviously for us in the West, we have access to a lot of it all the time. But in spaces like the Amazon, it's far and few between. So how do you get kids interested in questions like, why should I care about water quality? What does a robot do? What is a robot? And so one last thing is that we created this education program called Design Engineering for Climate Action. And we teach that at a school in London every Friday. And that embodies this idea of design, citizen science, activism, all together into one piece so we can start educating young people and tackling local environmental problems. But ultimately, all this leads to building up a sense of digital currency. And that means that, again, when we need to stand up and show evidence, or maybe we need to change or influence policy for something, we actually have so much leverage here to do that. And one last thought, this is a bit random, but I just thought I would put it in there. Nature-inspired cryptography. How can we build new relationships with nature in relation to technology? And there should be a GIF here, yeah. So this is one of my favorite things in the world, it's bird memorization. I was sort of sitting one day and I was like, don't it be really cool? Imagine you could encrypt data using bird memorization. So we take a 4D scan of a bird memorization from a few different points. And then it's so beautiful that it's not going to happen in the exact same way again. So there's a spontaneity there. And that means that, say we take that model, so a company comes to me and I encrypt data, and then I sell that sort of process back. That means that that company is then dependent on this species of bird being protected, because that's, in a way, what's generating the way for me to encrypt their information. So we can create new models where we create new dependencies between things, but also celebrate the profound beauty of nature. So forging new relationships, models, and ways to act. So cool. This is a real image. This is not AI generated, it's real. So with climate change on our doorstep, we as citizens should have a lot more options to do great things through technology and really question this idea of activism to make it more inclusive, collaborative, and exciting. We are but a frightened nanosecond, whereas nature is timeless. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
I was just wondering, so your product like monitors where the pollutants are in the river or whatever, but does it like inform authorities and everything just to clean it up, or just informs like people not to go there and that's it?
So we've actually been working with a water company since last September to develop this, which has been really great because then we have a link to industry. And one thing as an activist I'm really interested in doing is how can we build bridges and not walls? So I've been involved in activism for like 5-6 years now, and I know what works and what doesn't in terms of environmentalism. And so there's a real big opportunity to say, okay, look, if we have this data and the water company is, say, buying an office, how do they then use that to solve the problem? And there's many, many different ways that can be done. An example would be a SUDS system. So it's basically sustainable urban drainage. And they work in 5-year sprints. And it means that you create these hotspots, right? You create all these hotspots and you go, okay, there's billions of pounds that the national regulator want to give these water companies. What's your plan for the next 5 years for how you're going to tackle this issue? And so suddenly they have a reference point of where they need to spend that money for a specific purpose at a specific time. So it's all about informed decision making through this idea of crowdsourced data.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I have a question regarding the activism, because when you look around, you see maybe 2 different approaches. One is really showing like the negative impacts on like the climate change and everything, like really going into the bad future, what can happen. And the other one is really showing the good examples of where maybe we can move. But then it seems that maybe the big companies sometimes like use just some small changes in the way they operate, like these small examples, but they don't really, it doesn't include the whole, like the way they work, you know, like, I'm not sure if I'm explaining it correctly, but like that you can see the small changes, but it really doesn't affect the whole thing. But it's shown in a positive way. So like, which of these ways of activism would you think are better, and why?
This is such a great question, like so interesting. I mean, I guess sometimes it's almost like very black and white, isn't it? It's like, let's show positive things, let's show negative things. But I almost imagine it's an approach of duality. I think there has to be a balance, right? Because if you constantly show the negative things, you're like, fucking hell, like, what's the point, you know? But you show great things and you're like, oh, everything's going great, I don't need to do anything. So I think there's a balance there of like, you know, for me, design and life even is communication. You know, how even like organisms communicate, or how we communicate even through this presentation. So I think by highlighting the negative things that are happening, but then also showing what is happening to solve that problem and engaging citizens and making it very achievable, I think that approach is probably going to be best. So again, that sense of duality, which is why I'm trying to do what I'm doing. But really, really great question. I think it's, yeah, very interesting.
Last one.
Yeah, I was wondering about the data collection of your product. So you're saying, you know, now you have real-time data, whether, for example, as an individual, it's safe for you to go into this river or this lake or not. But what if you're accumulating this data? Can you do something with it? Like, can you create policy change with it? You know, so yeah, where are you going with that?
Yeah, 100%. One thing that's very interesting is that the Environment Bill in the UK came out in 2021, and many, many different things are on it. But one specific thing is that water companies need to monitor upstream and downstream from all their assets. So that's, you know, thousands of sewage outlets, and that's for the measurements that I described there. So there's a clear business need even for them to achieve that. But then there's also targets to reduce the amount of pollution that's in our waterways, even as a nation. And one thing that goes unnoticed actually is, you know, a lot of this conversation's been focused so far about water companies, but 70% or so of pollution in the UK is actually from other sources like agriculture. And so, you know, we can create policy change, but I think one thing that needs to happen is supporting people the right way. So farmers are the backbone of many different countries, because they obviously put food in your plate, right? And even in the UK, the suicide rate for farmers is pretty high. So they're working every day, 12-hour days, putting food in people's plates, quite traditionalist. You know, how do you design for that? So I think it's not just about policy change, it's about empathy, it's about how can we give opportunity for farmers to help improve their area or kind of get involved in climate action, but ensure that they're safe as well and that they can live really, really good lives.
Thank you.
No worries.
Thanks.
Thank you.